Welcome to this week's Facebook Live, where we're talking about how to preserve your own food, how to preserve your own medicine, grow your own, preserve it, use it. And the main emphasis that we're addressing this month is food security, because there have been a number of warning signals that we're moving into a time of inflation, a time of shortages because of the supply chain being broken. And I want you to be prepared so that you can have your own medicine, have your own food, and help your family right now in this time. So not everybody has a garden. Up the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about what you can do in your garden, but not everybody has a garden. So today I want to talk about foraging. Last week, we talked a bit about what you need for foraging. We talked about having a reliable food guide or reliable field guide for your region. And we talked about the tools you need and safety. And so you can go back and look at that video if you're joining me on YouTube. It's in my channel. And if you're joining me on Facebook, it will be in the videos for the group under the media file, so you can find that. So I'm not going to address safety. I'm not going to address field guides or IDs today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to address just specifically ways to preserve the wild food. And in that, we'll talk about wild medicine as well. I'm not going to talk about mushrooms particularly because next week, Sarah is going to come and she's written a book about growing and using mushrooms, and she's going to talk to us specifically about mushrooms. So we'll just take the mushroom issue and put it on the shelf, and we're specifically going to talk about the wild foods and the wild medicines that would include leaves, berries, and roots. And so, assuming that you harvested them safely and that you brought them home, what to do now? So mostly what you're going to find if you look in the literature, most people just say dry it. And that's good to a point, but there's other things you can do with it as well. So let's start with talking about drying, but then I'm going to move into talking about how to use the fresh food and how to preserve it fresh so that you can continue to use it. So wild foods that you bring in, you might be bringing in the leaves, which we'll call greens. You might be bringing in the fruit, and that'll be later in the season. That might be raspberries. It might be hawthorn berries. It might be wild blueberries. There's a large number of berries out there. Some of them would not be called berries. Some of them would be called haws. Some of them might be called other things, like rose hips aren't really a berry, but we'll class them all as berries for what I'm going to talk about. And then the other thing that you might be looking at are barks or roots. Generally, barks for food are considered survival food, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well today. So let's start with greens because that's what everybody's familiar with. And that's probably the thing that you're going to find the most easy compared to roots and barks, for instance. So when we're talking about greens, you can preserve them fresh. If you preserve them fresh, you will need to freeze them. Some greens that freeze well are things like pine needles. And again, always make a good ID. Make sure that you know what you're harvesting. Pine needles, bark tips, not bark tips, branch tips of evergreens. Like right now in my area, spruce tips are ready to harvest. And so I could bring those in and I could freeze them. Other things that you might freeze, just as general, would be probably the more bulky greens. If you're talking about thin leaves, like let's say linden or stinging nettle, dandelion, often the best way to do that is to dry it. So let's talk drying. If you're drying individual leaves, you want to separate them from the branch and lay them out on some kind of screen so that there's good air circulation. If you live where the humidity is very high, that's not going to be effective for you. That's more for desert climates or places where there's less humidity. For you, if you live where there's high humidity, you're going to want to use some kind of dehydrator, either a solar powered dehydrator or an electric dehydrator. Now, in a pinch, they can be dried in an oven at the lowest possible temperature and then keeping the door open. I don't recommend that for a lot of herbs because that tends to damage some of the antioxidants in the herbs. If you have an electric dehydrator, you can set it at a very low temperature, that deals with the humidity issue. And that's probably the best way to do it if you have an area where it's high humidity. If you have just normal humidity, or you heat with wood and you happen to be quite cold, like I am right now, I have my wood stove going. You can dry just in the room because the wood stove is going to take up the humidity in the room. So what I do if I'm drying in the room, I get a basket. I line the basket with either a paper towel or a cotton napkin. And then I put individual leaves, individual flower petals, and other kind of not too bulky things right in the thing. I might even do whole flowers. I do that with roses, whole flowers. Then I put it in a place where I'm going to see it and I'm going to remember it's there. And then I just stir it up with my hand as I walk past during the day. And I do that many times during the day, just flip it over so that, excuse me, so that the air gets access to all areas of the plant. Usually when I do that, I don't live in an area with high humidity, but I have moderate humidity. And usually when I do that, it's dry within 3 days. If I have a large bulk, let's say I went out and harvested a laundry hamper full of stinging nettle, took the leaves off, then I would probably want to use my dehydrator and I'd put it at the lowest possible temperature. And then again, I would rotate the dehydrator trays in order to dry it. If you're bringing in branches with leaves on them, what I do is I bundle it up and I put it on hooks around my living room. And again, I live where there's only moderate humidity, so that works for me. You want to keep those, like if you're hanging them to dry, they take a little longer, almost a week to dry. You're going to want to get them crisp so that even the stem is crisp. You don't want to just dry the leaves and then take them off because there's going to be some moisture in the stems. You'll end up with mold. So if you're hanging bunches to dry, you're going to want to make sure even the stems are dry and crisp for that. And hang them in a place where there's good airflow. And don't bundle them up too close together. I usually do a bundle that's about this big, the size of a quarter silver dollar, that size of bundle with the branches. And then what I do is I use an elastic band. If you use just a string to tie them, as they dry, the stems shrink and you end up having them fall out. So I use an elastic band and I tie them with the elastic band and then hang them from the elastic band. That works pretty good. And the elastic bands, usually they'll last for the time it takes to dry. Once they're dry, you want to take them down so they don't get dusty. Now I'm going to tell you a story. When I was first learning this technique, we were a wool farm and we were selling hand spun yarn and we were selling natural dyed yarn. And I had a carding machine in another room, but close to the room I was hanging my herbs. So I was carding the wool. We were doing natural dyes, as I said. So some of the wool was being dyed and then I was carding it. And I was carding it with an electric carding machine in a room away from where I was hanging my herbs. And I didn't think too much of the herbs because they weren't in my view. And a few weeks later, after doing a very large carding job, I went into the room where I was hanging my herbs and all my herbs were covered in wool, wool hair. I ended up losing my entire harvest of wild plants and even medicinal herbs that year. I ended up having to compost the whole thing because it was covered with hair. So I say that to say, pay attention to what other things you do in the room where your herbs are hanging. You don't want to hang them in a room where you're going to be carding wool or where you might be brushing your dog or where your cats are climbing the walls, right? Because you're going to preserve this for food, you're going to want to hang it in a room with good air circulation and no pets that are active in the room. And you don't want your kids spraying stuff in the air either. So don't put it in a room where people are going to be spraying things. And don't be me. You live and learn, right? So we talked about drying. Again, I'll just go over it. You can dry individual leaves or flower petals or flowers in a basket with good air circulation. If you have high humidity, you're going to want to use some kind of electric or solar dehydrator to do that and use the lowest temperature possible. Or you can hang them in bundles in a room where the air is not, you want good air circulation, but you don't want hair in the room or other things that are going to cling to your herbs. If you dry them in bundles, you want to take them down as soon as they're dry and remove the leaves or the flowers or whatever from the stems. Get them in glass jars for storage. And again, the test to see if they're dry is to crumble it. And if it crumbles easily, then it's dry enough. If when you try to crumble it, it kind of just bends, it needs a little bit more time. It must be bone dry before you store it. If it's not, the other thing you can do is put it in paper bags and hang the paper bags. And that works too. As long as they're paper, they're not coated with any kind of plastic or wax or anything. You can, I wouldn't do it with herbs that are wet, but if they've started to dry and you just need to protect them, you can take them off the branches, put them in the bags. This is how I dry seeds, is I put them in the bags. If you don't want to like stuff a bag with a lot of wet leaves, they won't dry properly. The stuff inside is going to get moldy. So just make sure if you're using the bag technique that your leaves are almost dry. What to do with the dry leaves? Well, you can use it for tea. You can powder it and you can use it in smoothies or soups. And that's my favorite way, is to dry a lot of different herbs, powder them, especially nutrient dense herbs like stinging nettle. And you can even add kale and lettuce and chard to that as well. Dry it, powder it, and then you've got something that you can use kind of as a supplement to add to smoothies. You can also add them to soups or sauces. And I even do that with pumpkins and a few other things that I have an abundance of in the garden. If you do powder it, you're going to want to use it within a year because once you powdered it, you're adding a lot of, you're oxidizing a lot of the antioxidants. So then they start to break down as they're exposed to air. So you want to use whatever you powder enough that you're going to use it right away. Don't powder it early in the season and then store it that way. Another way to use the dried, and again, this is one of my favorites, is to make something that's actually an ingredient in food, like a pesto or a pate, and store it in your freezer. And what I do is I store it in the small 1 cup jars. Here they're 8-ounce jars or 250 ml jars. So I make pesto, I make a pate, and I add my my wild leaves to that. So I have a dandelion pesto that I make. I have a stinging nettle pesto that I make. And I add everything that I would normally add to a pesto, like Parmesan cheese and a different kind of nut or seed, and then some garlic. And I put it through my blender. And then I make a large batch. I just spoon it into the 1 cup jars. You want to leave about 1 inch of headspace to allow for some expansion so the jars don't break. And then I just put those in my freezer. And then we take them out in the winter, use them, and we get the nutrient benefits of those wild herbs. A pate is basically just generally it's cooked, and a pate might have a base of something like, hummus is a type of pate where the beans are cooked and then you can add your wild herbs in, or your wild food plants. Let's move to berries. I think you've got an idea now about drying. Would you dry berries? You can. I would definitely use a dehydrator to dry them rather than try to air dry them, because berries tend to be very high in moisture. But you can also puree them. You can also take out the seeds and dry them as half berries to use in baking. Later, you can make jams and jellies, and I highly recommend having either a food mill or a jelly bag apparatus if you like to do that, because a lot of the berries have a lot of seeds. Like if you were to harvest wild raspberries compared to domestic raspberries, there is an incredible number of seeds to fruit, and you're going to want to remove those if you're making jam. You can also use wild berries combined with applesauce to make like fruit leather or jellies or anything like that, and preserve them that way. A really good source of recipes for preserving wild foods is this one. It's my favorite, actually. The pictures are amazing. Let me show you some of the pictures if you can see that. Really amazing pictures. It's called Foraging and Feasting, a Field Guide and Wild Food Cookbook by Dina Falcone. And that is available online, I believe, from her website. I'm not sure that Amazon carries this. I think I purchased it directly from her website. Again, Foraging and Feasting, a Field Guide and Wild Food Cookbook by Dina Falcone. And she has a lot of great recipes in there to just to whet your appetite for and anything in here you can actually use to preserve. Another way of preserving berries is to use them to make wine or mead. And there's some recipes on my blog to kind of guide you in that direction. And I should say you can also use flowers. I make dandelion mead every year as a medicinal. So you can use flowers as well as leaves for a mead, but berries have more bulk and will add more flavor. Let's see. If there's any questions, go ahead and just type them into the chat, and I'll make sure that I answer your questions. Let's talk about barks, because barks are a very good source of nutrients. If there is a time where your family can't get your normal food that you would buy at the grocery store, you can use the inner bark of some trees in order to make like a flour, or in order to add nutrition, and in order to add extra bulk to your diet. So some of the trees that you could do that with, pine is a traditional tree that First Nations people used. And it's the inner bark, not the outer punky bark, but that inner kind of paler colored bark that you would use. Birch trees also. Some of the barks are medicinal, so you're going to want to pay attention to that. Like birch and willow are high in methyl salicylates, which is like aspirin. So people who are allergic to aspirin wouldn't use those. But other barks are very mild tasting. Pine bark, for instance, also has some medicinal uses too. So what we would do is we would take the inner bark, scrape the inner bark off from already down trees. You don't want to kill a tree. If you take the bark off a tree, you could kill it. So you want to look for either branches or trees that are already down, and you can scrape the inner bark off. And for that, you can generally the inner bark comes off fairly thin, and you would be able to dry that in like a bowl if you have an airy place, or again, dry it just like you would dry like leaves. You do with the bark want to cut it into smaller pieces before you dry it. And then once some of the more woody things are dry, they're really hard to break into smaller pieces. So you want to cut them into smaller pieces while they're still moist, and then dry them. And then the other one is roots. And for roots, again, you want to make a really good identification to make sure you've got the right plant. So the time generally to do that is when the plant is either in flower or in fruit, but you're going to want to go back later to harvest roots. So you might want to mark on a paper to make sure you've got the right plant when you go back. And then the roots are generally harvested in the fall. And again, when you harvest them, pay attention to the things we talked about, safety last week, and being kind to the earth and making sure you know what you're harvesting. Assuming you've done all that, you bring your roots home, wash them first. And I actually use like a potato brush to clean them, to get the dirt off, because most roots have a lot of dirty crevices. I use a potato brush. And then once I have my clean roots, I cut them into smaller pieces, and you can actually air dry them once they're in the smaller pieces, again, in a lined basket. In fact, right now I'm drying some burdock root exactly that way. And even though we have a fair amount of humidity right now, the roots are fine and they've dried properly. If you are in a super high humidity area, you can use an electric dehydrator. That works too, or just a warm oven, not a hot oven, but just a warm oven will also work. And then for the roots, you can powder them. You can store them as whole roots and use them in tea. You can, some roots you can even add to soups and stews during the winter. So those are ways to use them. So we've talked about a lot about drying. We've also talked about how to use the dried food afterwards. We've talked a bit about making pestos and pâtés and putting them in the freezer and using them that way. We've talked about making fruit leather out of wild berries, and we've talked about drying roots. I haven't talked much about flowers. Flowers are great to add to tea and also to use for cosmetic products later. And flowers, I mostly just dry in a basket. You can remove the petals. For things like calendula flowers, you don't want to remove the petals because some of the medicine is actually in the green calyx. When you're touching the flowers, you'll feel kind of a greasy feel around the calyx. That's a resin, and that resin is a powerful healer. And so you're going to want to leave that green calyx and dry the whole flowers. But for some flowers, you can just dry the petals. Roses, I do both ways. And again, one of the easiest ways to dry them is just to line a basket with a cloth or a paper towel and dry them right in a basket in an airy place, and just stir it up whenever you walk past it. Really, it's very easy to dry and preserve food for winter that way. Once you've powdered it, it loses some of its shelf life. You're going to want to use that within 3 to 6 months. You could get away with keeping it for a whole year. And so you could, so once you powder it, you want to use it quickly. You can leave it dried and powder it just as you're going to need it. And I really recommend having a very strong blender for that. A NutriBullet type of blender works fine, but you can end up, it ends up getting quite hot if you've got a lot to powder. So I do recommend using like a Vitamix or a Blendtec blender with a small jar if you're powdering things. I have done it for years in a NutriBullet, and I have to tell you, it does get very hot. But the nice thing about the NutriBullet is it doesn't wear out the motor. It just gets hot and then it shuts off and then it'll turn on again. Some people recommend using a coffee grinder. I don't recommend that. I find that trying to powder dried herbs with a coffee grinder does tend to burn out the motor, and then you've lost your coffee grinder. Even if you get a coffee grinder and you're just using it for herbs, I find the same thing. I have done that. I've burned out motors because of that. So use a strong blender. That's the best bet. If you find as you're blending it's getting warm, you might want to just hold off and wait and try again in a few minutes after it's cooled down a bit, because you don't want to add too much heat. Once your herbs are dry, the heat is actually going to burn up some of the nutrients and antioxidants in that. So another reason to use a high-powered blender rather than something small like a NutriBullet. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And Sarah, could you put the link in for the powdered herbs, please, into the chat? that post on the blog about powdering the herbs, it has a nice chart that tells you what nutrients are in different herbs, and that can help you decide which herbs that would make good nutrient powders. And again, this book, one more time, it's called Foraging and Feasting, a Field Guide and Wild Food Cookbook by Dina Falcone. And I don't know who the publisher is, but I highly recommend this book. It's a beautiful book too. You can order it from your local library first to see if it's something that you want to keep in your personal library. I do want to address one other thing, and that's it's very important right now to build your personal library. If you're interested in gardening, or you're interested in herbs, or you're interested in making your own medicine, I really want to encourage you, don't trust the internet, but go get your own books, so that if the internet ever went down, you would have a library of reference books. If you have favorite websites where you go to all the time, websites can be fickle. They can suddenly go offline. We've seen a lot of that in the last 6 months, where they're censored and all of a sudden your favorite website is gone. I encourage you to make copies of recipes that you find that are important to you, or information you find. If a website has an ebook that you can purchase or download for free, take advantage of that, and then put it on a device that isn't dependent on the internet. So maybe you have like an iPad or something where you don't have to connect to the internet. Use that to store your digital copies, or put them on old-fashioned discs to save them, so that you have the information if the internet goes down, or if your favorite site is taken off the internet, so you don't lose that information. Some of this information is traditional information, and we are losing it. People are passing away, and books are being removed, and you can't get them anymore because they're out of date. We want to preserve that knowledge. So I really encourage you to build a personal library. And if you're relying on digital products, to make sure you have a copy of the digital products that you can access offline. All right, there's no questions. So thanks for joining me today. If you're catching this on the replay, go ahead and type in questions and I'll come back and answer them. And Sarah, were you able to share that link for the green powders?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, it's shared.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thanks for joining me, and I will talk to you next week, where we're going to be talking about using mushrooms in the garden. And Sarah's going to be talking to us.
One question, one moment.
Oh, there's a question? So Sarah's going to be coming and talking to us next week.
Okay, here we go. It didn't copy.
Oh. So I'm on Zoom and Sarah is transferring your questions to me.
There we go, from Martha.
So it takes a little bit. So Martha asks, I dried some peppermint outside, then it rained and dried out again. Does that change the composition or delete its constituents? Where is the best place to hang dry? I used a clothesline on my deck. So the test that I use to see if something is still good is, does it still have the smell that you expect? If it smells like peppermint, there's no off smells, then it's probably perfect, honestly. The general rule is that dried plant materials will last 1 year to 2 years. I have had 8-year-old peppermint leaves that I stored in a cool, dry place in the dark. And I thought, oh, these are 8 years old, I should throw them out. And as I was throwing them into my compost, I was hit with really strong peppermint, so I could have kept using them. But I had already started dumping them into the compost. So if it has a fresh smell, what you expect it to smell like, it's perfectly fine. And a lot depends on the storage conditions. If it's kept in a cool, dry place and it was dried well, then it should keep even longer than the 1 to 2 years suggested. And your test is, does it have the smell you expect? Even things like nettles that aren't fragrant have a smell. And as you work with herbs and work with wild foods, you recognize the smell, and you will be able to know. You'll have an intuition built that just tells you, this is still fine or this is no good. The one thing I just remembered, the one thing I didn't talk about was seeds. There are some seeds that are nutritive, like nettle seed, for instance, which has some adaptogenic properties and it's considered a superfood. For those, you want the seeds mature and you want them fully dry. And for those, I would put them in the paper bag and dry them that way. I probably wouldn't put them in the dehydrator just because they tend to fall through the holes. It's not a great solution. Or you could line that nice basket. And when I say basket, I mean a wicker basket. I don't think that plastic baskets will really do what you want. You're looking for a wicker basket or a grass basket. And if you don't have any at home, the best place right now to get them is either ethnic stores where they do like fair trade. Those kinds of stores have them, or go to your secondhand stores and look through the baskets. And you're going to want to line them with something, paper towel or a cotton napkin, for instance, just so that the small things, as they dry, they shrink so they don't fall through the holes. So I hope that helps. Thanks for joining me, and we'll be back next week. And next week, Sarah is going to be talking instead of me. So we'll see you next week.